to share some of our research on our working paper on the experiences of gifted and high ability Black learners in the public school system. And we were seeking to understand why Black students were underrepresented in gifted programs across the GTA, and why is it that it's more difficult for them to access this learning space. So we're going to share a little bit about our research and to raise questions on the absence or the lack of equity in the gifted program process.
Okay, so the theoretical framework that we're using to ground our work is critical race theory, which underpins race as a central side of oppression. And it also asserts that race is an oppressive systemic system that is tightly woven into the fabric of society. It also uses the narratives of racialized people as valuable forms of knowledge.
For our methodology, we engage in content analysis, looking at some scholarly literature, putting together and analyzing data and maps, again, analyzing policy documents from the Ministry of Education, and some scholarly reports as well. So just briefly, in regards to background information as it relates to gifted programs, special education for exceptional students, which includes gifted students, was first regulated in our province in 1982 and has since gone through some revision. So in 2001, the Ministry of Education recognized gifted as an exceptionality and mandated that it is the responsibility of school boards to provide special education programs and services for these students. In 1998, there's a regulation 181 concerning special ed requirements for boards to consider the placement of students identified as gifted first in their home classroom, in a regular classroom. That was the ideal placement that they wanted, but they have a range of options for the education of gifted students. So first, as we see here, there's an in-class placement where they would get additional support within a regular, if you want to say regular classroom. Then there's also withdrawal services. So every so often throughout the week, they will be pulled out for support services. And lastly, there is the contained or congregated, depending on which board, classes that students have. So those are the labeled gifted classes.
And also, in looking at the intersection of race and class, we also have to understand the context of the GTA, since we're focusing specifically on the GTA. So despite the rhetoric of multiculturalism, ethnic groups in the GTA tend to cluster in various enclaves, with visible minorities representing a larger proportion of poorer neighborhoods. There was actually a report done by the UN in 2010 which showed that 44% of children of African descent live in poverty in the GTA. Also, between 1981 and 2001, poverty went up for racialized people in the GTA 362%, while people of European descent, their socioeconomic status went up 28%. Also, another finding in that report was that 60% of all employed people of African descent make less than $20,000 a year, versus 55% of all visible minorities and 37% of those of European descent. And so at the very least, what we can say in the GTA is that so far what we're finding is that there's a problematic relationship that exists between race and socioeconomic status. And so in reviewing the literature, in actually asking this question, what is giftedness, there's a few debates. There's the nature and nurture debate, which basically argues, one side is arguing that giftedness is innate, biological trait, and then there's the other side that feels that it is a social construction. Renzulli, who's one of the leading scholars in talking about giftedness, argues that schoolhouse giftedness is usually the most common type of giftedness that is identified. These are students who are good at taking tests, students who are good at learning lessons, and their form of giftedness or ability is very easily measured by standardized tests. Those who argue on the side of it being a social construct, they argue that giftedness as we understand it is based on the eugenics movement of the 19th century and the early 20th century and its psychometric measures. which aimed to quantify and rank intelligence. It was also used to justify segregated education at this time, and also perpetuated a notion of those who were qualified as gifted would enrich society, whereas those who were quantified in the language they used was feeble-minded, contaminated society. And so, despite these debates, what scholars can agree on is that gifted behaviors can be developed in students. And often students are identified through IQ testing, teacher recommendations, as well as an evaluation of their work. But even though recent policy has encouraged schools to use all three of these methods, like IQ tests still tend to be the firm thing that will keep a kid in or out. So some of the benefits of identification: when a child is identified as gifted, according to scholarly literature, they have high teacher expectations, they get a lot of academic support, and also there are opportunities for advancement, such as enrichment, more trips, more resources, conferences, opportunities to extend their learning. Some of the issues that we're finding in the literature is that there's a weak correlation between students who are actually identified as gifted versus students who are actually high achieving. Also, in the US and in Canada, there isn't much research in Canada, but in the US what we find is that white, East Asian, and affluent students tend to be overrepresented in giftedness to a large degree, whereas Black, Latino, Aboriginal, South Asian, and Middle Eastern students are often excluded in gifted programs. We also are finding that the interventions that address giftedness, such as pull-out programs, research is finding that they don't necessarily do much to enrich the learning, and that contained programs actually do a little bit more for the students. So with all of this in mind, we are questioning, is giftedness a self-fulfilling prophecy? Is it a social construct?
Or is it something else? So we just wanted to share some of the data that we have come across in our research, and we relied heavily on TDSB stats because they are the only school board to date that is collecting disaggregated student information. So here we see that this chart here indicates that Black students are underrepresented in the academic stream and in gifted programs. So we see that the first column is the number of identified students as gifted. Blacks, there's that 7,882. Black students make up a total of 14.4% of the TDSB school population. This is from 2006-2007 school year. They made up 2.7% of the gifted population. Here we see students who self-identified their race in special needs programming. And so here the numbers for Black students are IPRC gifted. So these are students who have gone through the complete process of testing, the psychological testing. They represent 2.8%. Again, this is in 2006. Students, Black students without special needs status but receiving special needs services represent about 12%. IPRC non-gifted, so these are students tested, everything else but gifted, 22.1%. Non-identified special needs students and or IEP, 28.2%. And they again represent about 14% of the school board. So essentially, in terms of spectrum, we have higher functioning students, Black students representing almost 3%, but special needs students other than gifted students are pretty much 30% of those students are Black students.
Which is over twice their representation in the school board.
Then here, this again breaks it down a little bit more in terms of the students with special needs. First column is Black students. So special needs students in this grade 9 cohort, almost 5%. Students without special needs, 11%. So there's the learning disabled of that population, 17% are Black. A mild intellectual disability is MID, and that is about 32% of MID students in TDSB are Black. And other non-gifted exceptionalities, again, we have about that 28% figure, and students on an IEP only, not gifted. So IEP is the individual education plan where they get additional supports based on their need. And so these students may not have gone through the testing process completely, but are receiving support. And again, maintaining the number. So we see again here the overrepresentation of Black students as mild intellectual disabilities and underrepresented in gifted according to their student population stats.
And also too, just to go back to the literature, we can see that white students make up 34.2% of the school population, yet they represent 52.1% of the gifted program. And going back to literature again, East Asian students, 18.3% of the school board, yet 28% in the gifted program. And so I'm just hoping you guys can see this properly. Yes? Oh, shoot. So I'll just go through this quickly. We're running out of time, but this is just to show you guys the relationship between income, or how Toronto is segregated by income. So the pink areas are low income, the beige areas are middle income, and then we have the blue areas, which are the affluent or very well-to-do areas in Toronto. This is another map that kind of tries to put together race and class. So we see the dark green, the teal, dark red, and the pale, and the dark red are the affluent areas. So we see like the western parts of Brampton, parts of York Region, parts of Caledon, and in and around in Toronto, we see there are affluent pockets. The light and medium yellow that you're seeing are South Asian people of middle class who live in mostly large families. And then we see the dark yellow, purples, and the blues are working class communities.
So then we look at this data as it relates to where contained gifted classes are located across the GTA.
So this is a map that we created, and we put all of the gifted programs in the GTA that we could find. And what we found is that the green areas represent South Asian communities. The darker green means that there's a higher concentration, but the colors mean at least 25% representation in that area. The blue areas are Italian, brown areas Jewish, red areas Chinese, and the white areas are white. And what we see here, if you guys can notice, the gifted programs are all concentrated within the white areas. Even if they touch a little bit in an area, we see it's touching in Vaughan here in an Italian area, it's on the border, on the very border or cusp. So there's a correlation here between giftedness, race, class, geography.
So what were some of our preliminary findings? We noticed that there were some barriers, there were issues in regards to how standardized testing was taken up, and as Rhonda pointed out, that location is very much a factor in regards to where these programs are located. Money was very much an issue as well, because parents who could pay for the psychological testing to prove that their child was gifted in order to get that spot were able to go through that process much faster, and those results were not questioned. So TDSB recognized that there were equity issues in regards to the over and underrepresentation of Black learners in certain areas. TDSB is the only school board to collect that data. So how do we measure, if this is only one school board, how do we even begin to measure what's happening fully across the GTA? As well, we're looking at how to hold school boards accountable without measures in place. And so we're going to talk about the implications.
Okay, so first what we found are implications on Black parents. So there's an exhaustive process of knowing how to advocate for your child and rubbing up against these barriers to getting your child into an enriched program. Also, for students, we found that a lot of students, especially in the literature, there were psychological and social effects, social isolation, issues of acting white, so not necessarily fitting into the Black group, but then being excluded from the enriched group as well. Also, the lack of enrichment and support, and also a recent study came out in 2016, access to post-secondary education, which actually Black students, some of the barriers that they face are being placed in these special education programs that are not gifted, not being put into applied programs. These things all block them from post-secondary education.
So in conclusion, do gifted black students matter? Much time is spent on at-risk black students, but what are there spaces for students who are not at risk, spaces where they can thrive? If students are moved from that danger zone, then where do they go next? Is there a current structure in place to support black excellence, or even one that sees that as a possibility? And we talked about some similarities between Canadian data and American data. Spaces of education, in essence, reflects the dominant order. Race is very much spatialized. That's coming out of research from Catherine McKittrick. Gifted education maintains and reinforces white dominance, but also serves to restrict the ways in which cultural and social capital is transmitted. Further, it is a way of policing and restricting the spaces that black students that can occupy. And we see from our preliminary findings that placement in gifted programs is primarily a function of race, wealth, and geography.
And so our preliminary recommendations are to push the boards for more race-based data from the Catholic Board in Toronto, from Peel and the Catholic boards in York Region and Halton, and so that we can actually have the numbers to advocate for more for black children. Also to develop alternatives, or at least support for alternatives while these things are being done, so support for homeschooling parents, private institutions potentially, and also to reevaluate and the identification and placement strategies currently in place for gifted or high achieving students. Well, thank you.